Hello everyone, it's Lily here, aka Story Minded, and I'm going to make another video for the IGCSE anthology. Today I'm going to be looking at Whistle and I'll Come to You by Susan Hill, and she's an amazing author. I've read one of her books before called Black Sheep, and it was amazing. I've had quite a few requests to put other videos up on here, and I really want to help. But I'm also very conscious that we are pretty much on top of exam season right now. So I'll try my best to get up as many videos as I can, but obviously that takes time, and I won't necessarily be able to get the videos up before your exam dates, although I'm currently not working in education, so I have no idea when the actual exam dates are, but I'll try my best to help you. If you're starting to get nervous about the exams, I would highly recommend going to your teachers and speaking to them, or maybe searching different, maybe searching for the answers online. There's a really good website called the Student Chat Room, which is like a forum website where loads of people post their questions, and you can often speak to older students who have done their GCSEs and can give you advice and things like that. But the first thing I need to mention about this text, I'm trying to find, where is it? The first thing I need to mention about this text is that it is written in the Gothic genre, or with the Gothic style, and that's a very sort of particular style of text. Susan Hill, apparently she tends to write in this kind of Gothic genre, and that instantly gives it a very distinct style. That instantly lets you know that these texts are going to be very dark. They're going to have very dark themes. They're going to be very gloomy. They're going to be very suspenseful. They're going to be creepy. They're all those kind of ideas. And I won't have time to go into the history of like Gothic text because it's just so wide and vast, but it's really interesting. If you want to do some background research into Gothic texts, I highly recommend it. It's really interesting. But even the title, even if we start with the title Whistle and I'll Come to You, there's just something very uneasy and it's almost like quite a sinister sort of feeling that gives you, like, whistle and I'll come to you. Well, what's going to come to you? And I mean, usually you'd almost associate the kind of idea of whistling something with like a dog, like when you whistle, a dog will come to you. But there's just something about the phrasing of it, whistle and I'll come to you, that you just sense, well, what is this thing that's going to come to you? So like with the other videos, I'm just going to kind of go through, this is actually a shorter extract, and it's from a novel, so that's important to keep in mind, because obviously this will be a chapter from a novel, and it's from the novel The Woman in Black, and obviously that was turned into a film, and it's also got its own stage play, so it's been adapted into lots of different mediums. But this is from the extract of the novel, the original novel, and that is going to show us that whatever point of the text we're in, obviously characters may have already been developed. So, and it starts with a really punchy short sentence. During the night, the wind rose. So that's instantly starting to create a setting. It's starting to use sound. It's starting to sort of show that something is going to happen, like the wind is rising, and it's just setting the tone of this text that things are not going to be very positive. It's almost like you can talk about prophetic fallacy, and that's a technique where the weather is used to represent the emotion of the text, or it's used to represent some kind of idea of the text. So because the wind is rising, that's almost like the prophetic fallacy is almost like setting this ominous tone, like something's going to happen. We don't know what, but something is going to happen. It's creating suspense. As I had lain, and this is obviously narrative structure, so we know it's in first person. As I had lain reading, I had become aware of the stronger gusts that blew every so often against the casements, and casements are just windows that are set on hinges and are open like doors. And that also gives us some context. This suggests that the context of this text is that it's set in the past, although it hasn't specified when. Casements are quite like an old, they're like an old piece of architecture. But when I awoke abruptly in the early hours it had increased greatly in force. The house felt like a ship at sea, battered by the gale that came roaring across the open marsh. So this is building up setting again, and you can talk about the simile, this kind of idea that the house felt like a ship at sea. So the house, a house, you can talk about associations in text. So a house kind of gives you a sense of security, a sense of safety, but it's also like picking out differences. So you can either have a house or you can have a home, but it's really interesting. This is like talking about vocabulary choices here. So they've described it as the house felt like a ship at sea, not a home. So this place they're living in isn't, they don't have an emotional attachment to it. It's not their home, it's a house, and that can have a completely different meaning. And this sort of place that they're in, that you would usually associate with being like a home, safe, comfort, it's not that. It's at the complete mercy of this kind of ghostly wind that is blowing through, and all the verbs are very violent. So we've got battered, we've got roaring, and the setting is an open marsh, and that's a very sort of traditional Gothic setting to have on like a boggy marsh that is very dangerous. You could sink down into like the sinkholes, and they're very dangerous places to be. And it's like in Charles Dickens, he used an open marsh setting for Great Expectations, which has like a lot of Gothic themes. Windows were rattling, so once again we've got another very violent verb. We've got rattling, and that's like an onomatopoeia technique as well, everywhere. And there was the sound of moaning. That's a very lovely word. I like that word, moaning, down all the chimneys of the house and whistling through every nick and cranny. So it's kind of like building up all these onomatopoeia techniques and all these sort of violent verbs, and we're starting to gain the sense that this is a very unsafe situation that the character is finding themselves in. And the fact that they even use whistling in the text and the title Whistle and I'll Come to You, it's kind of putting us on the edge of our seats thinking, who is this? Who is going to come to this character? At first I was alarmed. Then, as I lay still, gathering my wits, I reflected on how long Eel Marsh House, so we have a name of the house, and eel is quite, obviously you get connotations of quite a violent, eels are quite violent, they have sharp teeth, they're like those slimy sea creatures. So the fact that it's called Eel Marsh House kind of gives you connotations of not so pleasant things. Had stood here, steady as a lighthouse, quite alone and exposed, bearing the brunt of winter after winter of gales and driving rain and sleet and spray. That's really interesting. It's almost like a very quick shift in emotion. So we've gone from quite spooky to the character reflecting on the fact that this is quite a poignant setting. So whenever you notice a change of emotion in the text, it can be really beneficial to highlight that in your analysis. And obviously, once again, it's very almost prophetic fallacy driven, I would say, this text. So you've got even more prophetic fallacy here. You've got the idea of like bearing the brunt of winter after winter of gales and driving rain and sleet and spray. And kind of the way they've used a lack of punctuation here, and they've used like a list technique, and sleet and spray is almost like very harsh sort of use of sibilants. Although sibilants, actually, I think it has to be next to each other. You might want to check that technique. That's like with the S sounds that are repeated. But with alliteration, you can have a gap in between words. So if not, it's alliteration. And it's almost like the way you have to say it, like sleet and spray, it's almost like you physically create that, the harshness of the weather battering against the house when you read the text. It was unlike, so that's like a structured technique you could talk about. How it makes you physically read is quite an interesting thing to explore. It was unlikely to blow away tonight. And then those memories of childhood began to be stirred again, and I dwelt nostalgically. That just means like they're reflecting, they're looking back. And often nostalgia is associated with pleasure, like happiness. Upon all those nights when I had lain in the warm and snug safety of my bed in the nursery at the top of our family house in Sussex, hearing the wind rage round like a lion, so once again a simile you could pick out and analyse, howling at the doors and beating upon the windows but powerless to reach me. So it's kind of showing this contrast of how they used to be to where they are now. I lay back and slipped into that pleasant trance-like state somewhere between sleeping and waking, recalling the past and all its emotions and impressions vividly until I felt I was a small boy again. So the character is obviously desperate to escape this situation. They're trying to go to sleep and they're trying to kind of banish these negative sort of events that are happening. It's really hard for me to obviously, because I don't know what the exam questions are going to be, it's very hard for me to pinpoint specifically what to analyse. I'm just trying to give you some ideas what to look out for when you're reading through a text. And like I said before, if you're unsure, I would highly recommend speaking to your teachers. Then from somewhere out of that howling darkness, a cry came to my ears, catapulting me back into the present and banishing all tranquility. So that's all peace, everything, all the positivity is just gone now. I listened hard, nothing. So that's a one-word sentence with the nothing. You can analyse a lot out of that. Just the idea that suspense, how there was all this sound and then suddenly it's just all gone silent. The tumult of the wind like a banshee, and the banging and rattling of the window in its old, ill-fitting frame. Then yes, again, a cry. That familiar cry of desperation and anguish, a cry for help from a child somewhere out on the marsh. Well, that's very creepy and positive. It's not positive. And it's interesting how it mentions familiar. So obviously where this is a novel, clearly this cry of a child has been heard by this character before, or something similar has been heard before. And I really love the tumult of the wind like a banshee. So a banshee is a folklore figure, and a banshee is usually almost like, I don't know how to describe it, it's almost like a spirit woman. And what a banshee was meant in folklore, what a banshee is meant to symbolise is it's a very bad omen, which means it's meant to symbolise your death. So there used to be a folklore around banshees that if you would see a banshee, it was meant to foretell your own death, or if not, a banshee is just meant to symbolise death in general. It's not a good thing to see a banshee. And if you hear the cry of a banshee, that's meant to symbolise that someone else, somewhere else has died. So that's all the connotations of death that they are creating with using that simile. There was no child. I knew that. How could there be? Yet how could I lie here and ignore even the crying of some long dead ghost? Yeah. So you could talk a lot about those rhetorical questions, almost like the idea of the setting itself is haunting this character, and yet they've also got this child. So not only is it the wind, they've also got this cry of the child that keeps reoccurring, because repetitions are really important in text. And because this is a novel, we can assume that more likely than not, this has been occurring throughout the text. Rest in peace, I thought, but this poor one could not. After a few moments I got up. I would go down into the kitchen and make myself a drink, stir up the fire a little and sit beside it, trying to shut out that calling voice for which I could do nothing, and no one had been able to do anything for how many years. So that's like an ellipsis after the 4, and then it goes into how many years. So that kind of shows that the character has suddenly interrupted their thoughts and they're thinking about how many years has this child, this ghost, suffered for. Sorry, that's the helicopters coming over. After a few moments... Oh wait, no, sorry, I've read that. As I went out onto the landing, Spider the dog following me at once. Ooh, so there is a dog, that's quite interesting. Two things happened together. I had the impression of someone who had just that very second before gone past me on their way from the top of the stairs to one of the other rooms, and as a tremendous blast of wind hit the house so that it all but seemed to rock at the impact, the lights went out. I had not bothered to pick up my torch from the bedside table, and now I stood in pitch blackness, unsure for a moment of my bearings. And the person who had gone by, and who was now in this house with me, I had seen no one, felt nothing. There had been no movement, no brush of a sleeve against mine, no disturbance of the air. I had not even heard a footstep. I had simply the absolutely certain sense of someone just having passed close to me and gone away down the corridor, down the short, narrow corridor that led to the nursery, whose door had been so firmly locked and then inexplicably, so that's unexplainable, opened. And that's interesting how we've kind of got this full circle. So how when our main characters was reminiscing and thinking about their past of when they were a child and they're safe in their nursery, there's obviously a nursery in this house, so that's kind of like an interesting parallel. But this door has been locked and now it's suddenly open, which is very creepy and sinister. Nurseries are quite a, especially abandoned nurseries are quite a sort of gothic. They give quite a gothic feel. Anything that's like decrepit or decayed, that's a very sort of gothic, a sort of gothic setting tends to be very like decaying and death orientated and gloomy and depressing and all those kinds of ideas. For a moment, I actually began to conjecture, so that's kind of like sort of argue with themselves, that there was indeed someone, another human being living here in this house, a person who hid rational explanation. Who hid themselves away in that mysterious nursery and came out at night to fetch food and drink to take the air, and to take the air. Perhaps it was the woman in black. So obviously that's the there's a word for it and I can't remember what word it is. Nope, I can't remember, but there's a specific word when obviously the actual title of the novel, this is just a chapter from extract from a chapter of the novel, but the actual novel is called The Woman in Black. So the fact there's this I can't remember the word of it, but there's a word that means the name of a character when they represent the title. I can't at the moment recall what that is. Oh, that's going to annoy me. I'll have to look that up. I might put it in the description if I find it. Had Mrs. Drablow, and apparently it says here she's the owner of Eel Marsh House. It was to sort out the legal matters arising from her death that the narrator had come to Cryfon Gifford. Oh, okay, so she's died. Had Mrs. Drablow harboured some reclusive old sister or retainer, that's someone who would like care for someone, and they're in service to a particular household. Had she left behind her a mad friend that no one had known about? My brain span all manner of wild, incoherent fantasies as I tried desperately to provide a rational explanation for the presence I had been so aware of, but then they ceased. So this is once again a very explicit text because it's in first person. This character is explicit means it's very direct, so they're directly telling us how they're feeling, how their mind is spinning, all these different thoughts. They're panicking basically, and I think I would be too in this situation. There was no living occupant of Eel Marsh House other than myself and Samuel Daly's dog, and apparently he was a prosperous landowner that Kipps met on the train to Cryfon Gifford. Whatever was about whoever I had seen and heard rocking, and who had passed me by just now, whoever had opened the locked door was not real. No, but what was real? At that moment I began to doubt my own reality. So we can kind of see that this character has been descending into madness because they're plagued by this sort of haunting event and all these like paranormal activity stuff that's happening. So that's kind of their indication that they are aware that they feel like they're losing their grip on reality. They don't even know what's real anymore. So that can kind of show that in this point in the novel, structure-wise, this character has probably been going through a lot of emotional trauma, and now it's starting to really impact on them. The first thing I must... Stupid red arrows are really annoying. The first thing I must have was a light, and I groped my way back across to my bed, reached over it and got my hand to the torch at last, took a step back, stumbled over the dog who was at my heels and dropped the torch. It went spinning away across the floor and fell somewhere by the window with a crash and the faint sound of breaking glass. I cursed, but managed by crawling about on my hands and knees to find it again and to press the switch. No light came on. The torch had been broken. So that could be very symbolic of, like, if there's no light, there's always this sort of idea that there's no hope, and the torch has now been broken, so now the person is just going to be in the dark. And kind of like the ideas of the actions are like groped and crawled. They're quite I can't think of the way to describe it, but it's very sort of like deliberate actions, and they're quite, it gives you ideas like crawling, it makes you think of a spider, and like the dog was called Spider, and it's all very sort of sinister and ominous, and it's kind of like if you're groping around for something, it's like a very sort of desperate action. For a moment, that's it, vulnerability, it shows vulnerability. For a moment, I was as near to weeping tears of despair and fear, frustration and tension as I had ever been since my childhood, but instead of crying, I drummed my fists upon the floorboards in a burst of violent rage until they throbbed. It was Spider who brought me to my sense by scratching a little at my arm, and then by licking the hand I stretched out to her. We sat on the floor together, and I hugged her warm body to me, glad of her, thoroughly ashamed of myself, calmer and relieved, while the wind boomed and roared without, and again I heard that child's terrible cry borne on the gusts towards me. So, and it also says down here, some of the themes in this extract are isolation, the supernatural, fear, a sense of the past. So it's very explicit, which means it's very direct. Like, there are some similes that are sort of put in here to sort of imply things, which is when it's implicit, which means it's a lot more subtle. But a lot of this, because it's written in first person, this character is being very direct with us as readers. They're telling us that they're not coping well. They're telling us that they're scared, and they're very concerned about what's going on, and they just keep hearing this child's cry that won't leave them alone. And it's interesting because you can tell by the archaic use of language in this that this is probably set not necessarily in the Victorian era, but I would check the actual novel to find out when it was set. But it kind of shows that the idea of masculinity back then was that you couldn't show your emotions. So the fact that the character is ashamed because they've lost control, they're showing this violent rage, and yeah, thoroughly ashamed of myself, calmer and relieved. So it shows that they're meant to be a very sort of traditional masculine character. And it's interesting how you could probably make some really interesting points about the fact that it's the woman in black, who obviously we only have this extract, so we haven't actually met this ghost or spirit character. But it's quite interesting how it's a woman who is causing him all this sort of potentially is causing him all this like turmoil and conflict and fear. It could be quite an interesting point to raise, like if you want to think about wider issues. But what I'm just going to leave you with is I've had a look at the assessment objectives again for the poetry and prose text on section A of the exam, and it says questions will test the following assessment objectives. This is why when people sort of say about the different 3 points, it's really hard to determine that because it all depends on the question. So whenever you do your PEE paragraphs, you always need to make sure you're relating it back to the question. And when you analyse, try and go into detail. Don't just skim over it and then move on too quickly. That's a really big mistake. So for example, if you have a point about this text creates a sense of isolation, that's your point, then you use a quote. Don't just leave that quote. You need to analyse that quote fully and try and get as much as you can out of it. Come up with alternative ideas. So suggest how it can create relate it to your point, but suggest how it creates it in one way and show an alternative. So that shows you're really thinking about this quote and you're not just looking at it in a sort of one-dimensional way. And always, once you finish your paragraphs, relate it back to the question. But anyway, all your examiner wants to find is read and understand a variety of texts, selecting and interpreting information, ideas and perspectives. So that's AO1. So ideas and perspectives can literally be anything. It could be thoughts and feelings, it could be themes, it could be associations, connotations, all the literary techniques you've been learning about, or hopefully have been learning about on your course. That's what they want to see. But it's not about identifying the technique, it's about recognizing the technique and then being able to explain what it is, what its purpose is in the text, or what its potential purpose is in the text. And then AO2, understand and analyse how writers use linguistic and structural devices to achieve their effects. So that's what we've been talking about here, like different types of language, vocabulary, punctuation, structure, long, short sentences. There's so many. So another really good thing to do would be to recap as many literary techniques, literature techniques as you can. Because the more techniques and terms you understand, the more you're able to identify them in the text. Anyway, I hope this has helped in some way, and I'll try to get another video up soon. Bye.